When a four-star general orders a retreat, soldiers obey. But in the blood-soaked dirt of a hostile valley, 45 highly trained German shepherds didn't care about rank or protocol. They cared about the man bleeding out in the sand. This is the unbelievable story of the military's greatest act of defiance. The heat in the Arghandab River Valley was a physical weight pressing down on the convoy like a suffocating wool blanket. It was mid-August, and Forward Operating Base, FOB Grizzly, was in the middle of a massive logistical nightmare. The base, which had served as the central hub for the Joint Coalition K9 Readiness Center, was being evacuated. Intelligence had warned of a massive insurgent offensive, and High Command had ordered the immediate extraction of the personnel and their most valuable assets, 45 highly trained military working dogs, all of them purebred German shepherds. At the center of this massive relocation was Corporal Thomas Hendricks. At 28 years old, Thomas was a veteran handler whose reputation bordered on legend within the K9 detachment. Beside him, panting softly in the stifling heat, was Bruno, a 90-pound German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt embers and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Bruno wasn't just a bomb sniffer or an attack dog. He was Thomas's shadow. The two had survived 3 brutal deployments together, surviving IED blasts, midnight raids, and the crushing psychological weight of war. They moved as one entity, communicating through subtle shifts in tension on the leash and quiet clicks of the tongue. The extraction was supposed to be a standard secure and move operation. A column of armored strikers and transport trucks wound their way through the jagged canyon pass, carrying the handlers, the 45 German shepherds, and a small security detail. Private James O'Connor, a 19-year-old kid fresh out of basic training, rode in the back of the lead transport, nervously gripping his rifle. He watched Thomas and Bruno with quiet awe. The dogs in the convoy were restless, their keen senses picking up on something the humans couldn't yet register. A low collective whine rippled through the transport bay. "Easy, buddy," Thomas murmured, running a gloved hand over Bruno's broad head. Bruno didn't relax. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, the fur along his spine standing straight up. Suddenly the canyon erupted. It didn't start with a gunshot, but with a deafening, earth-shattering roar. An improvised explosive device buried deep beneath the rocky road detonated directly under the lead striker. The concussive wave threw the massive vehicle into the air like a discarded toy, twisting metal and raining debris down on the rest of the convoy. Before the dust could even settle, the jagged ridges on both sides of the canyon lit up with a blinding barrage of rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine gun fire. It was a perfectly executed ambush. "Contact, contact, right!" screamed Captain Donovan, the convoy commander, his voice barely cutting through the relentless staccato of gunfire. "Dismount and return fire. Establish a perimeter." The transport trucks ground to a halt, tires blowing out under the rain of bullets. The back doors kicked open, and chaos spilled out into the blinding dust. Handlers scrambled to maintain control of their German shepherds. The dogs trained for combat, but overwhelmed by the sheer volume of noise and explosions, barked frantically, pulling at their leads. Thomas hit the dirt, pulling Bruno down with him, behind the shredded tire of a transport truck. The air was thick with the smell of cordite-vaporized diesel and copper. Bullets sparked against the armored plating above their heads. "O'Connor, get your head down!" Thomas roared, watching the young private freeze in the open, paralyzed by the sheer terror of his first firefight. A line of bullets kicked up the dirt inches from O'Connor's boots. The kid was hyperventilating, his eyes wide, completely exposed to the ridgeline. Thomas didn't think. Instinct drilled into him through years of combat took over. He dropped Bruno's leash, a command that strictly meant stay, and sprinted from the cover of the truck. He hit O'Connor at a dead sprint, tackling the young private into a shallow drainage ditch just as an RPG slammed into the side of the truck where they had been standing a second before. The blast was catastrophic. The shockwave threw Thomas backward, but it was the shrapnel that found its mark. A jagged piece of twisted metal, along with a volley of armor-piercing rounds from the ridge, tore through the vulnerable gaps in Thomas's tactical vest. He hit the ground, hard, the breath knocked from his lungs in a violent spray of crimson. A sound pierced the roaring battlefield sharper and more terrifying than the gunfire. It was Bruno. The German shepherd let out a guttural, almost human scream of anguish. Breaking his stay command for the first time in his life, the massive dog bolted through the crossfire, dodging bullets that chewed up the ground around his paws and slid into the ditch beside Thomas. Corporal O'Connor screamed, crawling toward Thomas, his hands shaking violently as he tried to apply pressure to the catastrophic wounds on Thomas's chest and neck. The blood was flowing too fast, soaking into the arid Afghan soil. Thomas's eyes were glassy, staring up at the hazy blue sky. He weakly raised a trembling, blood-stained hand, his fingers brushing against Bruno's snout. The dog pushed his heavy head into his handler's chest, whining frantically, licking the blood from Thomas's face, trying desperately to wake him up. "Hold on, Tommy, just hold on!" Captain Donovan yelled over the radio, pinned down behind the smoking wreckage of the Striker. "We need medevac now. We have a man down massive trauma." But as Donovan looked up at the sky, his heart sank. The horizon was turning a violent, bruised purple. A massive haboob, a terrifying wall of dense sand and dust, driven by gale-force winds, was sweeping down the valley, moving faster than a freight train. The battlefield was about to be swallowed whole, 200 miles away, in the air-conditioned, sterile environment of the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram Airfield. Four-star General Arthur Hayes stood stone-faced before a wall of glowing monitors. The screens displayed real-time drone footage of the canyon glowing in harsh green and white infrared. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone could have predicted. General, the ambush is a reinforced battalion. A stressed intelligence officer reported, frantically typing at a console. "They have our K9 convoy boxed in. Casualties are mounting. We have 3 dead, 7 wounded, and 1 in critical condition, Corporal Hendricks. But sir, the weather. It's a worst-case scenario." General Hayes leaned over the console, his jaw tightly clenched. He had commanded men in the Gulf in Fallujah, and now here. He knew the heavy, suffocating burden of command. He watched the massive thermal bloom of the approaching sandstorm on the radar. It was a Category 5 haboob. "Air support," Hayes demanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Grounded, sir," the flight commander replied, shaking his head grimly. "The Apaches can't fly in that dust. The turbines will choke and stall in seconds. Black Hawk medevac is completely blind. If they try to land in that canyon, they'll clip the ridges. We cannot get a bird in the air." Hayes stared at the glowing white dots on the screen. The small cluster of American forces was completely surrounded by a tightening ring of enemy heat signatures. If they stayed in the valley, they would be slaughtered. The only chance of survival was a harsh, grueling trek up the northern ridge to a fortified bunker system known as Rally Point Echo, but it required an immediate, fast-paced vertical climb, a climb that a dying man could not make. "What is the status of Corporal Hendricks?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. A medic's voice crackled over the radio, distorted by static. "TOC. This is Grizzly 2 Actual. Hendricks is fading fast. We can't stop the bleeding. Pulse is thready. If we try to carry him up that ridge in this fire, we'll lose the whole squad. We need a bird." The silence in the command center was deafening. Every officer turned to look at General Hayes. The 4-star general closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The hardest part of the stars on his collar was the arithmetic of human life. He had to sacrifice one to save 50. Grizzly 2. Actual, this is command. Hayes spoke into the microphone, his voice devoid of emotion, though his knuckles were white as they gripped the desk. All air support is grounded due to weather. The enemy is closing on your position. You cannot defend that valley. I am declaring this extraction mission a failure. Abort the recovery. Static hissed back. Command repeat. We have a man down. I know, Captain, Hayes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Immediate retreat to Rally Point Echo. Take the dogs, take the able-bodied, leave the fallen. That is a direct order. May God forgive us. Move now. In the canyon, Captain Donovan received the order, like a physical blow to the stomach. The sandstorm was beginning to hit, stinging their exposed skin and reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. The enemy fire was getting closer, echoing eerily through the howling wind. Fall back, Donovan roared, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. Everyone grab a leash. We are pulling back to the northern ridge. Move, move. The handlers trained to follow orders even when it broke, their souls began to grab their gear. Private O'Connor was sobbing, refusing to let go of Thomas. Donovan physically grabbed the young private by the collar and dragged him backward. He's gone, kid, he's gone. We have to go. Grab his dog. Grab Bruno. Donovan shouted to one of the senior handlers, Sergeant Miller. Miller lunged forward through the swirling dust and grabbed the heavy leather leash attached to Bruno's tactical harness. Come on, Bruno. Let's go heal. Bruno didn't budge. He stood directly over Thomas's motionless body, his front paws planted firmly on either side of the corporal's bleeding chest. Bruno, heal! Miller screamed, yanking the leash with all his strength. The German shepherd whipped his head around, baring a terrifying set of white teeth. A deep, vibrating growl erupted from Bruno's chest, a warning that sent a chill down Miller's spine. Bruno wasn't just refusing a command. He was declaring ownership of the ground he stood on. With a vicious, violent shake of his head, Bruno snapped the heavy metal clasp of his leash right out of Miller's hand. Bruno stepped fully onto Thomas's body, standing tall. He let out a booming, resonant bark that echoed over the gunfire. It wasn't a bark of fear. It was a rally cry. What happened next defied every manual of military protocol, every hour of behavioral conditioning, and every scientific understanding of canine training. Down the line of retreating soldiers, another German shepherd stopped, a dog named Rex. His handler tugged his leash, but Rex dug his paws into the dirt, staring through the dust at Bruno. Suddenly, Rex ripped the leash from his handler's grip, bolting past the retreating soldiers and sliding into the ditch to flank Bruno. Rex, no! His handler screamed. Then it was a female shepherd named Sasha. Then Titan. Then Maverick. Hold your dogs, Captain Donovan screamed into the radio panic setting in. Keep control of your K9S. But it was completely futile. The bond of the pack, triggered by Bruno's overwhelming grief and absolute defiance, overrode years of strict military conditioning. One by one, leashes were snapped out of exhausted hands. Collars were slipped. Commands were ignored. Through the blinding, howling sandstorm, an incredible sight unfolded. 44 highly trained German shepherds broke ranks and sprinted back into the kill zone. They didn't run in a chaotic frenzy. They moved with terrifying predatory precision. In seconds, 45 military working dogs converged on the shallow drainage ditch. They didn't huddle. They didn't cower. Operating on an ancient primal instinct, they formed a massive, tightly packed 360-degree perimeter around the fallen body of Corporal Thomas Hendricks. 45 German shepherds, shoulder to shoulder, their ears pinned back, their teeth bared, staring out into the blinding dust storm toward the approaching enemy. The handlers stood frozen on the ridge, completely stunned. They were watching an army of dogs deliberately choosing to stay behind and die for a fallen soldier. Down in the valley through the heavy static of the command radio, General Hayes listened as Captain Donovan whispered words that would haunt the command center forever. Command. The dogs. The dogs refuse to retreat. They've formed a wall. They are guarding the body. The Haboob swallowed the Arghandab River Valley in a matter of seconds, turning the bright, unforgiving Afghan afternoon into a suffocating, abrasive midnight. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. The roaring wind sounded like a continuous freight train, drowning out the crack-crack of insurgent rifles and the terrified shouts of men. Up on the northern ridge, Captain Donovan and his surviving squad were pinned down behind jagged outcroppings of shale. The grit tore at their exposed skin and jammed their weapons. Down in the valley, swallowed entirely by the swirling brown abyss, were 45 German shepherds and the motionless body of Corporal Thomas Hendricks. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram Airfield, the high-definition screens had dissolved into static and chaotic thermal interference. General Arthur Hayes stood paralyzed, his eyes locked on the faint, distorted infrared blooms flickering on the secondary monitors. The massive dust storm was masking most of the heat signatures, but through brief, agonizing breaks in the storm's density, the satellite caught fragmented glimpses of the kill zone. General, the enemy forces are advancing on the convoy wreckage. The intelligence officer reported, his voice tight with dread. Thermal shows a platoon-sized element moving down the canyon floor. They are converging on Corporal Hendricks's position. Sir, the dogs are still there. They're going to slaughter those animals, a staff sergeant whispered in horror, staring at the screen. But the German shepherds were not sitting ducks. These were not household pets. These were Tier 1 military assets, bred for extreme aggression, conditioned for combat, and possessing senses that far surpassed human technology. The Haboob, which blinded the advancing insurgents, was an undeniable tactical advantage for the K9S. Down in the choking dust, Bruno stood over Thomas. His golden eyes narrowed against the stinging sand. The air was thick with the scent of approaching men, gun oil and unwashed sweat. Bruno didn't bark. A bark would give away their exact position. Instead, a low, barely audible vibration rumbled in his throat. It was a primal signal understood instantly by the 44 other K9s forming the perimeter. The insurgents moved blindly through the wreckage of the Striker, their AK-47s raised, expecting to find the wounded American soldiers huddling in fear. The lead insurgent stepped past a burning tire, peering into the swirling dust, looking for the easy kill. He never saw Rex. With zero hesitation and absolute silence, the 85-pound shepherd launched himself from the shadows. Rex hit the insurgent squarely in the chest, his jaws locking onto the man's weapon arm with a sickening crunch. The insurgent's scream was instantly swallowed by the howling wind. Before the man's comrades could even register the attack, two more K9s, Sasha and Titan, struck from the flanks. They utilized a deeply ingrained military tactic: hit, incapacitate, and release. They dragged the front line of insurgents into the dirt, disarmed them with crushing bites, and melted back into the impenetrable wall of sand before a single shot could be fired. Panic erupted among the enemy fighters. They began firing wildly into the blinding storm, their muzzle flashes illuminating the swirling dust in brief, terrifying strobe lights of orange and yellow. But they were firing at ghosts. The dogs operated with a terrifying hive mind. They maintained their tight defensive ring around Thomas, but they established a rotating outer perimeter. Whenever an insurgent stumbled too close to the drainage ditch, a squad of 3 or 4 shepherds would break from the circle, neutralize the threat in the darkness, and immediately return to the pack. They fought with a ferocious, disciplined silence that shattered the enemy's morale. Insurgents were being dragged down into the darkness by unseen predators, their frantic cries echoing through the canyon. Up on the ridge, Captain Donovan listened to the chaotic gunfire below. He couldn't see the ditch, but he could hear the screams of the insurgents. He looked at Sergeant Miller and Private James O'Connor. The young private's face was streaked with mud and tears, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. Captain Miller shouted over the roaring wind, his voice cracking. "We can't leave them down there. We cannot abandon our dogs. We don't leave our pack behind." Donovan looked at his radio. He knew the orders. General Hayes had commanded a retreat. To go back down into that valley was a court-martial offense, assuming they even survived. But as Donovan looked at the faces of his handlers, men and women, who had raised, trained, and bled with these animals, he knew there was only one right choice. Military law dictated one thing, but the unspoken law of the Brotherhood dictated another. "Screw the orders," Donovan growled, racking the charging handle of his M4 rifle. "Fix bayonets. Check your ammo. We are going back into the shit. We are getting our boy, and we are getting our dogs." A collective roar of defiance went up from the exhausted soldiers. They didn't care about the odds. They didn't care about the court-martial. Led by Captain Donovan and Private O'Connor, the squad abandoned the safety of the high ground and plunged back down the treacherous, shale-covered slope, diving headfirst into the blinding maw of the Haboob. Back at Bagram, the radio cracked to life. "Command, this is Grizzly 2 Actual." Donovan's voice barked through the static, completely breathless. "Be advised, we are disobeying the retreat order. We are advancing on the valley floor. We are recovering Corporal Hendricks and our K9 detachment. Grizzly out. Captain Donovan, halt your advance. That is a direct order." General Hayes shouted into the comms, but he was met with dead air. Donovan had cut the feed. The command center fell into a stunned, heavy silence. General Hayes stared at the flickering monitors. He was witnessing a full-scale mutiny, but as he watched the faint thermal blips of Donovan's men rushing back into the kill zone to fight alongside a perimeter of fiercely loyal dogs, a strange, profound sense of awe washed over him. The four-star general slowly lowered the microphone. "Godspeed, Captain," Hayes whispered. He turned to his flight commander, his eyes blazing with a sudden, desperate resolve. "Major, prep the Medevac Blackhawks. Spin up the rotors." "Sir, the weather." "I don't care if the rotors chew through solid rock," Hayes roared, his voice echoing off the walls of the tox. "When that storm breaks by even a fraction of a mile, I want those birds diving into that canyon. We are not losing these men today." The descent into the valley was a nightmare of disorientation and flying debris. Donovan's squad moved shoulder to shoulder, firing blindly at the muzzle flashes of the panicked insurgents, but the enemy was already breaking. Terrified, bleeding, and convinced they were being hunted by desert demons, the insurgent fighters began to fall back, abandoning their ambush positions and retreating into the cave systems along the southern ridge. Donovan and his men pushed through the wreckage of the convoy. "Thomas Bruno." O'Connor screamed, his voice tearing his throat. Suddenly the wind shifted. For just a few seconds, the eye of the sandstorm passed over the valley floor, creating a brief, hazy clearing in the dust. The soldiers stopped dead in their tracks, lowering their weapons. There in the center of the carnage was the drainage ditch, and surrounding it was a sight that would be burned into their memories forever. 45 German shepherds sat in a perfect, unyielding circle. Their coats were matted with blood dust and diesel fuel. Some were limping, others were bleeding from grazing bullet wounds or shrapnel. But not a single dog had abandoned the perimeter. In the dead center of the circle lay Corporal Thomas Hendricks, and lying directly on top of his chest, completely shielding Thomas's exposed neck and torso with his own massive body, was Bruno. "Hold your fire, friendly," Sergeant Miller yelled, stepping forward with his hands raised, speaking in a calm, authoritative voice to prevent the hyper-vigilant dogs from attacking them. Easy pack. Good dogs. Release. Hearing the familiar commands of their handlers, the brutal tension in the perimeter finally broke. Tails began to give exhausted low wags. Sasha whined and limped over to her handler, burying her head in his chest. Rex sat down heavily in the dirt, panting. O'Connor and Donovan rushed to the center of the circle. Bruno didn't move. He kept his heavy body pressed firmly against Thomas, looking up at O'Connor with wide, pleading eyes. The dog let out a heartbroken whimper. "Good boy, Bruno. Let me see him." O'Connor choked out gently, placing a hand on the dog's blood-soaked flank. Reluctantly, Bruno shifted his weight, sliding off Thomas's chest, but keeping his chin resting on the corporal's arm. Donovan dropped to his knees, pulling a trauma kit from his vest. Thomas was completely pale, covered in a horrific amount of blood from the shrapnel wounds in his chest and neck. He looked entirely lifeless. "He's gone, Cap," Miller said softly, removing his helmet. Donovan ignored him. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of Thomas's mud-caked neck, right below the jawline. He closed his eyes, blocking out the howling wind, feeling for a miracle. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Donovan's eyes snapped open. "I have a pulse!" he screamed, his voice cracking with utter disbelief. "It's thready, it's weak, but he is alive. Get a pressure dressing on his chest now." It was a medical impossibility. With the amount of blood Thomas had lost, he should have bled out in minutes. But as Donovan wiped away the grime, he realized the impossible truth. Bruno hadn't just been shielding Thomas from the storm. The 90-pound German Shepherd had been lying directly on top of the catastrophic wound, his immense body weight acting as a living, breathing tourniquet. Furthermore, the collective body heat of the 45 dogs, huddled closely in the ditch, had staved off the deadly onset of shock and hypothermia as Thomas's blood pressure plummeted. The dogs hadn't just guarded his body, they had literally kept him alive. Grizzly 2, actual to command. "Hendricks is alive. I repeat, Corporal Hendricks is alive," Donovan roared into his radio. "We need immediate dust-off. The storm is breaking." High above the valley, the heavy thwack, thwack, thwack of helicopter rotors cut through the dissipating haboob. Major Peterson had flown his Black Hawk dangerously low, skimming the jagged canyon walls completely blind until the storm momentarily parted. "Grizzly, this is Dust-Off 1. We have your strobe. Coming in hot," the pilot's voice echoed over the net. The massive medevac helicopter flared its nose, kicking up a blinding cloud of residual dust as it touched down hard on the canyon floor. Paramedics rushed down the ramp with a litter. "Load him up! Move, move!" Donovan yelled. They hoisted Thomas onto the stretcher. As they began to carry him toward the waiting helicopter, Bruno suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the canvas edge of the stretcher, with his teeth refusing to let them take his handler away. "Let him on the bird," Donovan commanded the flight medic. "The dog goes with him. All the dogs go." It took 3 Black Hawks and 2 Chinook transports to lift the men and the 45 German Shepherds out of the Arghandab River Valley, as the helicopters banked hard, rising above the canyon walls into the clear blue sky. Private O'Connor sat on the floor of the cabin. He looked across the bay. Bruno was curled tightly next to Thomas's stretcher, his head resting gently on the corporal's combat boots as the flight medics worked furiously to stabilize him. Around them, 44 other German Shepherds lay exhausted on the metal flooring, their handlers weeping quietly as they bandaged the dog's paws and checked their wounds. Not a single man or dog had been left behind. 6 weeks later, the sterile white halls of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center were quiet. General Arthur Hayes, in his pristine dress blues, walked down the corridor, his boots clicking softly on the linoleum. He stopped outside a private room and gently pushed the door open. Corporal Thomas Hendricks sat up in his hospital bed, heavily bandaged, pale, but breathing on his own. At the foot of the bed, taking up most of the mattress, was Bruno. The dog's ears perked up as the general entered, but he didn't move from Thomas's legs. Hayes stood at the foot of the bed. For a long moment, the four-star general didn't say a word. He looked at the young corporal, and then he looked deeply into the golden eyes of the German shepherd. "I ordered them to leave you, Corporal," Hayes said, quietly, the heavy burden of command evident in his raspy voice. "I declared the mission failed. I wrote you off to save the rest." Thomas offered a weak, tired smile. He slowly reached down, running his hand through Bruno's thick fur. "I know, sir. It was the right tactical call. Tactics," Hayes scoffed softly, shaking his head. "Tactics don't account for loyalty, Corporal. I've studied warfare my entire life. I've read every manual, commanded thousands of troops. But nothing in my career prepared me for what your K9 detachment did that day." General Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't hand it to Thomas. Instead, he stepped forward and gently clipped the shining metal medal to Bruno's heavy tactical collar. It was the Dickin Medal, the highest award for animal gallantry in combat. "They mutinied against a four-star general," Hayes said, a faint, proud smile breaking through his stoic demeanor. "And thank God they did." The general stepped back, snapped a crisp textbook salute to the young corporal, and then, in a breach of all military protocol, he rendered a slow, respectful salute to the German shepherd. Bruno let out a soft huff, resting his chin back on Thomas's legs. His mission finally complete. The bond between a soldier and his dog had defied orders, defied nature, and ultimately defied death itself. And in the annals of military history, the story of the 45 K9s, who held the line, would never be forgotten. If you were amazed by this unbelievable true story of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between soldiers and their K9s, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to honor Bruno and the 44 heroic German shepherds. Share this video with your friends and family, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible gripping stories of real-life heroism. Thank you for watching.